Welcome to Table Talk, a place to gather, guide, and go. Each month, join your hosts, Alyssa DeLosSantos and Jill Dobrowansky, as they discuss scripture, life experiences, and everything in between. At our table, we provide a seat for those who have been told there is no room for them. We look forward to having you gather, guide, and go with us each month at Table Talk, where there's always room for one more at our table.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Table Talk, a place to gather, guide, and go. And as always, I'm joined by my host, Alyssa DeLosSantos. And
Hello.
we also may have a special appearance from little Miss Kaya, who is currently sitting on Alyssa's lap. So if you see these little ears pop up during this, you'll know it's her.
Or hear a little bark.
It's all good. This is life, right? Whether we're sitting at the banquet or the bistro table, this is life.
This is life at the table, in fact.
Yes. Yeah, and really, and it also goes to show that we have a seat for everybody at our table. You did that
Even
very
when it's
gracefully,
unoccupied.
my friend.
I know. I'm so sorry about that. This is real life at the table. It's not pretty always, right?
Right. I love it. And it's funny because
sometimes it's complicated.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting because some people have sent me messages going, "Are your glasses purple?" And I'm like, "No, I just have that special UV filter on them. So depending on how the light from the computer screen hits them, they look like I have purple lenses." So
Oh, that's funny. I've never thought that.
it is. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, the life,
so good.
The life of a glass wearing person, it's all good.
I do know.
The life of a dog mom.
Just saying. Just welcome to our world, and we're so glad you're here. Actually, we really are so glad you're here for this episode and this season, right? About Banquet and Bistro. So good. What about last time? What did we talk about last time? Showing up at that bistro table.
Last time we talked about that and how important it is because, there's times that we can be at the banquet table and not feel like we're a part of it.
Yeah.
But when we are at the bistro table, we're having a seat there, and the expectation is that you are going to be an active participant in it. And I love that. I love that conversation. I love how we're calling this season, the banquet table and the bistro. And, both you and I have always, and we're going to continue this season to stress that.
Yeah, it's true. We talked a lot too about the vulnerability that's kind of required at the bistro table and how so often our avoidance of vulnerability actually pushes us into a place of loneliness and isolation. We talked about there's intimacy to be had and experienced at the bistro table. But it is really important that we're not immune or ignorant of our tendency to be protective in that space too, right? To sort of avoid it, to avoid feeling things deeply in our heart or being held accountable or being challenged by something. But when we show up to the bistro table, we have this privilege of carrying someone else's story. I mean, that's a privilege that alone, that privilege is worth showing up when it's risky, when it's messy, when your dog won't stop barking. I mean, all the things. Just showing up there is such a privilege. But I was thinking, Jill, that, I have a programmed response. I think I could probably speak for everyone in saying that it's not just me with a programmed response, but we have these programmed responses that keep us from the bistro table.
Alyssa, Your video cut out.
I thought my phone was on Do Not Disturb. Welcome to the comedy of errors. Okay.
I'm sorry, continue. Because we're leaving this in. It's,
This is our life. Okay. I was just, we have these program responses that keep us from the banquet table. The bistro, banquet and bistro really, but specifically the bistro, which are our natural responses, our instinct of fight, flight, or freeze. And so often I don't fight it or have this flight response. I have a freeze response. I kind of do nothing. But the trick is in those sorts of things, when we feel unsafe, right, we just kind of tend toward fight, flight, or freeze. But the reality is if we think we're just doing that in one scenario, we're wrong. That carries over into our relationships, and it has an impact on these bistro moments. And if we're not careful, we find ourselves locked into a prison of loneliness of our own making, right? We're either fighting against it, we've ran from it, or we're just freezing. We're doing nothing at all. And that's a scary prospect, actually.
Yeah, and it's interesting because for me, it depends on the scenario and the situation. So if I'm inviting somebody to the bistro table and I will go into fight for them. I will be that fight. I will, be that person for them. However, when it's myself, it's a little bit different. And that's when similar to you, 9 times out of 10, I have that freeze. And that's when I isolate myself. I've talked about this before. I isolate myself. I deal with my emotions internally, and I turn introspectively, and I stop looking up. I stop looking in the Word. I stop reaching out to friends. And that's when somebody else who notices that goes into fight mode for me and pulls me to sit at that bistro table. And like you said, that vulnerability is hard.
Yeah.
I mean, especially for somebody like me, and you're similar in the same way. We were raised to be strong, independent women. We were of that generation, and we were told that other women were competition and that we should be comparing ourselves to them and not, embracing and not supporting one another. Yes, we do that with a small group, but especially, like in the larger picture with each other, it's always that level of, oh, well, I can show this level of false vulnerability.
True.
With people who I know or I have not established trust with yet, because really that's what it comes down to at the core of it. It's about trust. Right. And if I haven't established that trust, or you've hurt me and I feel like I can't trust you anymore, there's going to be just a very surface level vulnerability if I ever show it.
That's so true. And you know what? Like some of our program responses are these false evidences of vulnerability. Like I know the right things to say. Do you know what I mean? I know the right things to say to be like, as if I'm present, right? As if I'm exposing a piece of my heart. I can say the right things, but saying the right things creates its own kind of prison for a heart that is longing for someone who's just begging to say, hey, I've forgotten who I am. Would you remind me? That's what we do at the bistro table. We pull up and we're like, I've lost my way. Tell me who I am. And that requires trust, because you won't know who I really am if I don't feel that there is reciprocity and trust, because I might trust you, but if I don't feel like you trust me, there is this hesitation. There is this holding back, if you will. And I think that's why in a study that Cigna Health Insurance did in, I think, 2018-19, They reported that 61% of Americans reported in their survey, 61% reported feeling lonely and socially isolated, thus referring to loneliness as a social, if you will, epidemic. And there's something for us to say, it's important to be aware of that, because the person you think doesn't want to come to the bistro table, what if that's not really the truth? What if they're desperate to come, but they don't know how to get there? Can we be the gentle and kind, a gentle and kind space for someone to land, not fixing their problems, but just sitting with them? And we've talked about that before, just sitting in that space with each other. I mean, it just creates so much credibility. You know, that reminds me of a woman from scripture, actually probably one of my favorite narratives in scripture, in John 4, the woman at the well. And this woman in John 4, she doesn't just have a story, she has history, if you know what I'm saying. And so much so that her community, we can infer that her community has not let her forget her past indiscretions, her decisions, her mistakes. We can trust that they have not let her forget those. And there's some reasons why, right? Pause. Get in. Finger. So they haven't let her forget, and it's all with good, I mean, reason, like meaning the ammunition that they have against her is real, doesn't make it right, but real doesn't always make it right. But it's a Samaritan, she's a Samaritan woman. And it's funny because in John 4:4, the scripture says that now regarding Jesus, now he had to go through Samaria. And of course, you just do a little poking around and you know that wasn't true. He didn't have to, and he shouldn't have, and he does. And he goes to this town well and sits there while the rest of the disciples leave for a minute. And here comes a woman carrying her empty vessel to the well. She comes with her physical need for water. And what's so interesting in the interaction that you can read about in John 4 is that she comes with a physical need, but Jesus knows there's a greater need. And I love what happens when, first of all, her coming alone is just points right to everything we're talking about. And she should have been with other people. And when she comes alone and he engages in a conversation with her, which was super countercultural for him to initiate a conversation with her, which reminds us how intimate he desires to be with us. She's been married a few times. Her community has remembered every single one, apparently, potentially keeping score. We know she's not in good standing with her sisters or friends in the community because she comes alone. But you know what? The reality was, we know she wasn't in good standing at the banquet table. So if she wasn't in good standing at the banquet table, you know she didn't feel like she had an invitation to the bistro table, right?
Yeah.
But God, right? Which is my favorite. Those are my favorite words in scripture, because it reminds me that God accepts and pursues who others shun. What a word. Like, that's a model for us. So while he accepts and pursues whom others shun, he initiates this conversation with her. He doesn't shame her as she tells her story. He invites her to the proverbial bistro table as he listens to her, as he asked her questions, as she answered. You know she had a programmed response, right? To be afraid of his reaction to her history. But we see that our history is really his story. His story of restoration, of connection, of redemption in and through us. And that happens at the bistro table. See, because the bistro table, that too. The bistro table is about we. It's not about me. This is the essence of community. We over me.
That is so true. And there is so much to unpack in that. And we've talked about this before when we talked about community and allowing our community to carry us and not condemn us.
Yes.
But you touched on that when you said that, she knew people were keeping score, and she was keeping score herself.
Right.
And that's almost like our human nature is to do that. But what we have to do is we have to be the ones who push pause on that, just as Jesus did, and said, no, okay, fine. Yeah, that's what you did. That's not who you are. Because what you do doesn't define who you are in God's eyes.
All day.
Right? And it also reminds me of that's the real life story you told about when you were going through your divorce and your friend showed up in your bathroom, like to get you out and to say, no, this freeze that you're in, we're going to be the ones to fight for it and to fight for you. And like, that's exactly what Jesus was doing with this woman, was that he was like, no, I'm here for you. And yes, he said, it's one of the most infamous I am statements. I am the living water comes from this piece of scripture. But it's just like you were talking about, like she went to that well to fill a physical need.
Yeah.
And what she walked away with was so much more.
Yeah.
And that's what can happen at the bistro table.
Right.
And that is what unfreezes us and allows us to then fly. And that's all that we have to do.
Yeah. She had forgotten who she was.
Yeah.
She had you nailed it about her identity. She had forgotten her value. I mean, this is not unique to her, right? She was as empty as the vessel that she carried to the well.
Yeah.
And that's not lost on me on all of this, the contrast then with Jesus saying, I am the living water. In essence, I can fill you up. I can remind you of your great value. I am your worth, right? This is who I created you to be. She came thinking she needed water, but what she needed was this moment with Jesus to remember. Scripture is replete with this phrase, remember, 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 because we are inclined to forget. She reminds us how we're inclined to forget, or if we've not forgotten, maybe we're just recalling all the wrong things. As you mentioned, she didn't let herself off the hook either. She kept score, right? So we're inclined to remember what's not right. And so in this moment, this bistro table moment she has with Jesus, she's reminded who she really is, and it changes everything. She told the whole truth. She didn't shrink back. When he says, go and get your husband. And she just makes a decision in that moment. And she says, I don't have one. And she tells the whole truth. And it's her disclosure of the truth that invites this intimacy, right? Because she could have given 1 million responses to that, right? He's sick. He's out of town. He can't walk. She could have lied her way through all of that. But this truth at this moment at the bistro table unlocked her prison of isolation. And how do we know? Because when we read a little further in John 4, in fact, John 4:39 says, many of the Samaritans from that town believed in him, referring to Jesus, because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I ever did. Okay, so she runs back to the community that had not welcomed her at the banquet table. And here they receive her differently because she decides to no longer keep score herself. And she shows up anyway. That's a word for us, to show up anyway, regardless of what we think the community is thinking about us, because we might be wrong. They also might be wrong. And she goes back and she discloses this story. You know, they were like, okay, what is happening? Because she is all of a sudden, she's excited that he told her about her whole history, because it is his story. And she shares, and then many become. And it reminds me of this. She first worked out her story at the bistro table before it could become a meal at the banquet table.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. Sometimes I wonder if we have that backward. We're trying to walk in a freedom in a public arena when we haven't accepted the gift of a reinstated identity and value and worth in that more intimate relationship, first with the Father, but then with someone else who can be the hands and feet and the voice of the Father at the bistro table. Working out our story there so that we can provide nourishment at the banquet table, that's not lost on me in all of this.
No, and what's also important to note is that you're going to leave some crumbs at the bistro table that you no longer need, because they're not nourishing you anymore. Because when you think about it, she came with an empty vessel. Nowhere in scripture does it talk about her leaving with it. She left it at that well.
Yes.
So she left that score. She left those crumbs at the bistro table because she was ready to move to the banquet table, and she knew that they were no longer a source of nourishment. And that, for me, that is what I always have to remember, that I can leave part of myself at the bistro table because that part of me is no longer serving, is no longer serving the way that I've been called to serve. And although I may never forget, I am not required to use those crumbs anymore as my source of nourishment. And it reminds me of, we talked about this during our pre-production meeting, is who's singing your song back to you?
Yeah.
And what verses are they singing? Because that's also important too.
True.
It's, when Jesus met her, he gently reminded her, like, yeah, I know you've done this. And oh yes, by the way, I also know that this is your current situation. But just like he did with Martha, that we talked about last episode, it was done in a gentle, non-judgmental way.
Yeah.
And he sang back a song of forgiveness. He sang back a song of grace. He sang back to her a song of, that part of you is dead. Now let's go forth. And we see that that's exactly what she did when she went back to town.
Yeah, exactly. And the multiplication of her allowing her history to be his story. And that happens at the bistro table. But you make a point, Jill, about the way we carry ourselves at the bistro table really matters. So no one wants to show up in that situation to be condemned or to be fixed. Do you notice that in this interaction with Jesus, he doesn't actually fix her, he reminds her. I think this is the what we should underscore in this entire thing is that when we show up at the bistro table, we have one job: to remind each other whose we are and then who we are because of our remembrance of whose we are. And so, listen, you can show up at a bistro table if it's not pointing you to greater faith, calling you higher in your relationship with the Lord, then the nourishment isn't going to be, it'll be temporary. It won't be long-term nourishment, right? And that's important for us who want to be at the bistro table, who are inviting others, or if we're being invited to the bistro table, it's important that we go, okay, I don't need to bring my prescription. And so often what we want is a prescription, and God is saying, hey, actually, I'm looking for action. Would you marry faith and action? You don't need a prescription. You don't need to do seven steps to X, Y, or Z. You don't need a prescription. We want that, right? It's our human nature to want the easy fix and want the way out. But he's saying, actually, would you just marry what you believe with action? Just do something. Just show up. Just invite someone else, which leads us beautifully into the go for this month, right? We want this to be so practical, where like send a text to someone today. Whenever you're listening to this, no matter what time it is, send a text to someone, call someone who has forgotten their value. Call someone who you've maybe not been in communication with in a while, but their worth to you is greater than maybe you've ever articulated. The thing is, this is an invitation to the bistro table when we do such things. And I think it's the little things, Jill, that become big things. And I think we should call ourselves and each other to the standard of being people who are all about the little things.
It is so, that's so true, because, and it's in those moments when you never know when that phone call or that text is going to unfreeze or bring someone who might be in flight right back. And I'm currently in a season where I'm sitting at a bistro table with a good friend of mine, and she pulled me there. And I talked a little bit about that on one of the other episodes. I came, kicking and screaming, a little bit in that fight mode, because I was frozen. But she did not let up. And we're currently reading and working through this book by Clea Wade, and it's called Heart Talk: Poetic Wisdom for a Better Life. And it's a small book, but it's like every page has something powerful on it. And this past week, I read something which I would like to share, because it really, to me, sums up everything that Jesus did in his ministry, but also what we're being called to do, that call to action that you were talking about. Yeah. And on page 53, it says, life does not always hand us the easy road. Life does not allow for us to be in the right frame of mind to always do the right thing at the right time. To know this is to remember that we are human. We are not born knowing the best way to navigate the worst circumstances. We are all more than our mistakes.
Yes.
Our mistakes do not make us bad people. Our mistakes, when met with awareness and personal responsibility, are actually what introduce us to our best selves. You are beautiful because of all your experiences, the good, the bad, and the imperfect. And for me, that's exactly what Jesus showed all throughout his ministry, but very specifically to this woman. And, we've said this before, sometimes, most times throughout scripture, we don't have names because we can insert our own name at any one of those lessons and Jesus moments at any time.
Yeah. There are stories.
Yes.
By his design. Your poem, that poem reminds me of that very thing that you read, and we'll link that title in the notes. But, someone needs to know that. Someone needs to hear those exact words, right? Even if it's just, do you remember how valuable you are? Or I think you're really valuable, or I admire our friendship, or your grit, or it's so little and yet it's so big. You just said that. We just don't know when what feels like a little thing is a huge thing in someone else's story, in someone else's journey. And I think we ought to be really, really gentle and careful with those friendships that we have, those people who we are in bistro table moments with. Also the banquet table. There are people sitting at the banquet table who are just desperate for one person to say, hey, I see you, I know you, and I'm glad you're here. We just don't know how that will interrupt and intersect authentic need and make a difference. It sure has made a difference for me.
Yeah, me too. And whether you are that person this week, with the go, whether you are the person reaching out to someone, sending them a text, going, hey, I was just thinking or praying about you and just wanted to let you know, or you're that person that is sending those 3 little words that I had to send to my friend. I am struggling. That's it. That was all I had the energy to put in that text. And she knew that I had to move from that banquet table to that bistro table. And, just pulled me right up and pulled that high top stool right up next to me and said, okay, let's do this together. And, no matter if you're on the receiving or the sending end of this week's go, just remember to, like you said, do it with love, do it with grace, and do it with humility. Yeah, because that's exactly what Jesus did.
Exactly.
Oh my gosh, Alyssa, as always. Ooh,
So good, friend. So
good. So good. Oh, all right. And if you are the one who is struggling with loneliness, especially as we are still struggling with this season of isolation across the world, we'll definitely link some resources for you, or reach out to us, send us a DM or send us a quick note, and it could always be just those 3 little words, I am struggling, and we will respond and we will help you and we will point you in the right direction, and you'll always have a seat at our table. As always, thank you. We're blessed to have you joining us this month at Table Talk, a place to gather, guide, and go. And as I always say, don't forget to connect with us on the socials and click that subscribe button. Or, if you feel so inclined, if your go this week is to reach out to someone, share this link with someone who might need to hear this episode. And until next time, my friends, God bless.